In the aftermath of a zombie outbreak, the remnants of human civilization were scattered and isolated. Cities lay in ruins, overrun by the undead, and survival was a brutal game where trust had become a rare commodity. In this chaos, one small community stood as a beacon of hope, the last safe haven where survivors clung to life, hoping that someday they might find a way to rebuild. But that hope was fragile, and the future uncertain. The small group of survivors had settled in an abandoned military base on the outskirts of what used to be a thriving city. They had fortified the compound with walls, makeshift barricades, and a vigilant watch, but every day was a constant struggle to fend off the growing number of zombies that surrounded their haven. Supplies were dwindling, tensions were rising, and the fear of betrayal was palpable. Among them was a young leader named Ethan, who had stepped up to guide the community in the absence of more experienced leaders. Ethan wasn't the typical leader. At just 24 years old, he had been a college student when the outbreak occurred, and the horrors of the apocalypse had turned him into a reluctant leader. His leadership was forged out of necessity. He wasn't the strongest or the most skilled fighter, but he had a keen mind for strategy and a deep empathy that made people trust him. His leadership was built on the belief that unity and cooperation were the only way forward in this bleak new world. The community was diverse, with people from all walks of life. There were former soldiers, doctors, farmers, and even teenagers who had grown up in the new world. They had all come together under Ethan's guidance, drawn by his vision of a future where they could fight back and reclaim the world from the undead. But as the days wore on, the cracks in the foundation of their fragile alliance began to show. Ethan had always known that the human element was just as dangerous as the zombies themselves. There were whispers in the compound about factions forming, about people who were beginning to question Ethan's leadership. Some thought his strategy of keeping a low profile and focusing on survival was too passive, while others believed he wasn't doing enough to strike back at the zombies. The tension in the compound was rising, and Ethan could feel it in the air every time he walked into a room. On this particular day, Ethan stood at the watchtower overlooking the desolate landscape. The wind was bitterly cold, and the sky was clouded with smoke from distant fires. The world outside the walls was a wasteland, cities, farms, and homes long forgotten, now claimed by the undead. But within the compound, there was a sense of something more, a flicker of hope that, if they could just hold on, they might one day be able to rebuild society. As Ethan surveyed the area, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew the zombies were only part of the threat. The real danger now came from within their own walls. He had to keep the group united, but the whispers of dissent were growing louder. He couldn't afford to let the community fracture, not when they were so close to achieving their ultimate goal, survival. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Ava, the community's medic, approaching. She was one of the few people Ethan trusted implicitly. Her calm demeanor and unwavering loyalty had earned her a place by his side. "Ethan," she said softly, "we need to talk." He nodded and followed her down from the watchtower to a quiet corner of the compound. "What's going on?" Ava hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's a problem with the supply run team. They're not back yet, and it's been longer than expected." Ethan's heart sank. The supply runs were critical to their survival, and if something had gone wrong, it could mean disaster for the whole group. "What do you think happened?" "I don't know," Ava replied, "but I've heard rumors. Some of the others think we should send a rescue team out there. But we can't afford to lose anyone." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. The loss of the supply team would be a blow to their already strained resources, but sending a rescue team could also jeopardize their safety. It was a difficult decision, one that would test his ability to lead. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The world was darkening, both literally and metaphorically. There were no easy answers, and every decision carried a weight of consequences. But Ethan knew one thing: he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. He had to act decisively, for the sake of the people who were depending on him. "We'll go," he said, his voice firm. "Prepare a team. We'll leave at dawn." Ava nodded, her expression serious but resolute. "I'll get the team ready." As she walked away, Ethan felt the heavy responsibility of leadership settle on his shoulders once more. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: the fight for survival was only just beginning. And he would do whatever it took to keep the flicker of hope alive in a world consumed by darkness. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The air was crisp, and the world felt eerily silent as Ethan stood at the gates of the compound, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The weight of the decision to send a rescue team pressed heavily on him. There was no turning back now. If the supply team was in trouble, they had to be saved, no matter the cost. Ethan had assembled a small, skilled team for the mission. Ava, the calm and collected medic, was by his side, ready to patch up any injuries that might come their way. Along with them were 3 other survivors: Mark, a former soldier with quick reflexes and sharp instincts; Rachel, a farmer who had an uncanny knowledge of survival tactics; and James, a mechanic who could fix anything, from engines to barricades. Together, they represented the best of the community, the ones who had shown resilience and adaptability in the face of constant danger. "We leave now," Ethan instructed, his voice steady but urgent. The others nodded in agreement, gathering their gear and weapons, ready to head into the unknown. As they passed through the fortified gates and left the relative safety of the base behind, the mood shifted. The moment they stepped into the wilderness, the world felt different. No longer were they in the controlled environment of the compound. Now, they were in the heart of the apocalypse, a hostile world where every shadow could hide a threat, every rustle in the underbrush could signal the approach of the undead or something far worse. The group moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow on the ground. The air was heavy with tension. Ethan led the way, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. The silence around them was unnerving, and it seemed like the very world was holding its breath. It wasn't long before they reached the edge of a once thriving town, now a ghost town, consumed by the encroaching undead. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, the remnants of the old world. Broken windows and decaying buildings stood as silent witnesses to the collapse of civilization. "This is where we lost contact," Ava said, her voice tinged with concern. The supply team was supposed to check in from air. Ethan nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon strapped to his side. "Stay alert," he warned. "We don't know what we're walking into." They moved cautiously through the streets, sticking to the shadows, their movements deliberate. As they passed an old grocery store, a sudden, eerie sound broke the silence, a low growl, followed by a series of hissing noises. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Zombies. He motioned for the group to stop and crouch behind a rusted car. The growling continued, growing louder, and Ethan could hear the shuffle of feet on the gravel. His pulse quickened. They were close. "We need to get out of here," Mark whispered, his hand tightening around the grip of his rifle. Ethan's mind raced. There was no way they could move through the town without drawing attention. The undead were everywhere. But they had no choice, they had to find the supply team, and they couldn't afford to waste time. "Rachel, James, flank left. Ava, stay close to me. Mark, you cover our rear." "We move in a tight formation," Ethan ordered, his voice commanding but calm. Without waiting for a response, he led the charge, moving swiftly through the streets. The group stayed low, using the abandoned vehicles and wreckage as cover. The growls grew louder, and Ethan could see the shadows of the zombies lurking just ahead, searching for their next victim. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a collapsed building, a survivor, barely alive, dragging himself along the ground. His clothes were torn, and his face was covered in dirt and blood. It was one of the members of the supply team. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward him, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. "Stay with me," Ethan said urgently, kneeling beside the injured man. The survivor's eyes flickered open, but there was a vacant, lifeless look in them. It was clear he had been bitten. I couldn't, they came out of nowhere," the survivor mumbled, his voice weak. They're still out there." Before Ethan could respond, the survivor's body went limp in his arms. He was gone. Ethan's stomach churned, but he didn't have time to mourn. The group was still in danger. They had to keep moving. "Move, now," he shouted. The group quickly retreated, but not fast enough. The sound of shuffling feet reached their ears, followed by the unmistakable growls of the undead. Zombies began to appear from around corners, stumbling toward them in a mindless frenzy. "Get to the building!" Ethan shouted. "We need to regroup." They sprinted toward the nearest abandoned building, a once strong brick structure now weathered by time and decay. Ethan pushed the door open, and the group rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and rot. But it was shelter, for the moment. As the survivors caught their breath, Ethan's mind raced. They were running out of time. They had to find the rest of the supply team, and fast. But the zombies were closing in, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that they would be surrounded. "We need to move again, now," Ethan said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Stay close and stay quiet." The group nodded, preparing for whatever came next. Outside, the groans of the undead grew louder, but Ethan's resolve had never been stronger. He would do whatever it took to keep his people alive, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. They couldn't afford to lose hope, not now. Not ever. "You said." The building was silent, save for the heavy breaths of the survivors, who clung to what little safety the walls offered. Ethan stood by the cracked window, peering through the grime-covered glass, trying to assess the situation. The groans of the undead echoed in the distance, but they were growing louder by the second, signaling that the horde was drawing near. "We can't stay here long," Mark muttered, checking his rifle one more time. "They'll find us. We need a plan." Ethan's mind raced. He had to think fast, had to make the right call. The building they were in offered temporary shelter, but it was far from secure. The undead could breach the windows or force their way through the door at any moment. They had no time to waste. He glanced around the room. It was a small, abandoned office, with piles of old papers and overturned furniture scattered around. Nothing that could help them escape. His eyes locked on a small, rusted fire escape ladder outside the back window, just a few feet away. It was old, barely functional, but it might be their only way out. "Fire escape," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We can't stay here. We take the ladder, head for the rooftops, and move through the city. We'll use the higher ground to get ahead of the horde." Ava nodded. "It's risky, but it's the best option we've got." "Right," Ethan said, turning to the others. "Everyone grab your gear. We move fast. Mark, take point. Rachel, you're with Ava. James, keep watch." The group quickly gathered their supplies, water, medical packs, ammunition, and whatever they could carry, and moved toward the fire escape. The air was thick with tension, and each creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should. As they neared the window, Ethan heard the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet growing nearer, closer to the door. The zombies were coming. He motioned for the group to hurry. "Go, go, go!" Mark was the first to climb through the window, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he ascended the fire escape ladder with surprising agility. The others followed suit, one by one, each of them casting nervous glances over their shoulders, knowing that time was running out. Ethan was the last to climb, making sure to keep an eye on the door below. The sound of the zombies outside was deafening now. Just as he reached the top, the unmistakable groans of the undead filled the building. A thud against the door followed by the sounds of scraping nails echoed in the small room. They were too late to stop the zombies from reaching the building. The barricade wouldn't hold for long. Mark was already at the top of the ladder, scanning the rooftops. "Clear for now," he said, his voice low and focused. Ethan took one last glance at the window they had just escaped from. The zombies were at the door now, clawing their way through. The safety they had found was already slipping away. "Let's move," Ethan ordered. "Stay close, don't make a sound." The survivors sprinted across the rooftops, their footsteps muffled by the snow and debris scattered across the cracked surfaces. It wasn't the easiest terrain to navigate, broken pipes and fallen bricks littered the ground, but it was higher ground, and for now, that was enough. They moved swiftly, zigzagging between buildings to avoid detection. As they continued forward, Ethan's thoughts kept drifting to the supply team. The injured survivor they had found had mentioned other members of the group still being out there, but there was no way to know exactly where. The horde had likely driven them deeper into the city. Ethan could only hope they weren't too far away. "We're not going to be able to stay up here for long," Rachel said, her breath coming in short gasps. "We're going to have to make a move soon." Ethan nodded, scanning the streets below. The shadows of the undead shuffled in and out of view, some moving in groups, others wandering aimlessly. But there were too many to count, and they were getting closer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The odds were stacking against them, and he could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. "We'll take the alleyway ahead," Ethan said, pointing to a narrow passageway between two buildings below them. "If we can reach it, we'll have a better chance of slipping through unnoticed." They continued to move quickly, ducking behind chimneys and air conditioning units to keep out of sight. Their eyes were wide, scanning the streets below for any signs of movement. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of zombies snarling. A group of them had spotted something, maybe another survivor or perhaps a scent in the air, and they began to move in their direction. "Run!" Ethan shouted. The group dashed towards the alleyway, the sound of their footsteps thudding in their ears as they pushed themselves harder. The air was filled with a sense of urgency, each survivor driven by the need to stay alive. Ethan felt the weight of the decision he had made. He had to keep them safe. But as the group reached the alley, they were met with a horrifying sight: more zombies, creeping out from the shadows, blocking their path. Ava gasped, clutching her medical pack to her chest. "We're trapped." Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't go back. The horde was too close, and the alley was now a dead end. They were running out of options, and the only way forward was through the growing mass of undead. He gritted his teeth. "We fight." Mark quickly raised his rifle, scanning the area for the closest zombies. "We fight our way through." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. It wasn't the ideal choice, but there was no turning back now. They were in the fight of their lives. The alleyway seemed to close in on them as the zombies shuffled forward, their eyes lifeless and mouths open in a constant, hungry snarl. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened as the survivors readied themselves for the inevitable battle. The narrow alley, littered with debris and abandoned items, wasn't much of a fighting ground, but it was their only choice. "We can't just stand here," Rachel said, her voice sharp with panic. "We need to make a move, now." Mark nodded, adjusting his rifle as he scanned the zombies closing in. "On my mark. We'll fight our way through and head toward the main street. It's our best shot at breaking free." Ethan glanced at each member of the group. Their faces were determined but tinged with fear. He knew they didn't have much time. Every moment they spent in the alley made it harder to escape. The undead were relentless, and the noise from the battle would only attract more. "Stay tight," Ethan ordered. "Cover each other, and don't let anyone fall behind." Without another word, he dashed forward, taking the first swing at the closest zombie. His blade sliced through the air, meeting the undead with a sickening thud. The creature crumpled to the ground, but more were coming. They weren't slowing down. Ava moved in right behind him, her medical pack now strapped tightly to her back, and her makeshift weapon ready. She jabbed at the nearest zombie, knocking it back, but it quickly regained its footing and lunged at her. "Move!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Ava's arm and pulling her out of the way just as the zombie snapped its teeth where she had been standing. The sound of growls and snarls filled the air as the undead surrounded them. Mark fired his rifle, dropping two zombies with precise shots, but the noise was already attracting more of the horde. His eyes narrowed as he continued to shoot, but his concern was growing. They were surrounded. "We need to break through." Mark shouted, reloading his rifle. James and Rachel worked in tandem, fighting off the zombies with brutal efficiency. James swung a metal pipe he had picked up earlier, knocking a zombie to the ground with a sickening crack. Rachel, with her farmer's strength, used an old gardening hoe to push the undead back, using its long handle to keep them at a distance. "Get moving!" Ethan yelled again, now fully aware of how close the undead were. They couldn't hold out for long. "To the street!" With a shared look of determination, the group moved forward, cutting through the zombies one by one. Each swing of their weapons felt like a battle for survival. Ethan was forced to shove a zombie aside, feeling the cold, clammy touch of its decaying hand brush against his arm. It made his skin crawl, but he didn't have time to think about it. He had to keep fighting. They pushed forward, gaining a few precious feet with every step, but the zombies just kept coming. They were relentless, feeding off the sounds of chaos, drawn to the energy of the fight. There was no escape if they didn't act quickly. The alleyway finally opened up into a small courtyard, and Ethan could see the main street just beyond it. It was their only chance to break free, but it wasn't going to be easy. The horde was closing in from every direction, and their path to freedom was blocked by an even larger group of zombies. "Over there!" Rachel shouted, pointing to a narrow gap between two buildings. "We can squeeze through, but we have to hurry." Ethan nodded, his heart racing as he turned to the others. "We have to move now. Keep your distance, fight through as much as you can." Mark, Rachel, and James began to push through the zombies, clearing a path toward the gap. But just as they were about to reach it, a loud crash echoed through the courtyard. Another wave of zombies, drawn by the noise, had stumbled into the area. "We're not going to make it!" Ava cried, her voice cracking with fear. She was backing away, her face pale as she swung her weapon, desperately trying to keep the zombies at bay. "There's too many of them." Ethan's mind raced, his eyes scanning the courtyard for any possible escape. He knew the risk was high, but they couldn't stay here. The gap Rachel had pointed to was their only hope. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed Ava by the arm and hauled her toward the opening. "Come on! Now, Ava!" He heard her feet shuffling behind him as she sprinted toward the gap. Mark was already ahead, clearing the way, while Rachel and James pushed forward, holding off the undead with everything they had. Ethan reached the gap and threw himself through it, tumbling into the alley on the other side. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned around, watching the others follow. One by one, they made it through, but just as Rachel was about to pass through, a zombie lunged at her from the side, grabbing her by the leg. "Rachel!" Ethan shouted, rushing to her side. With a single motion, he slashed at the zombie, sending it sprawling. But more were coming. He could hear them behind him, shuffling toward the gap. The alley wasn't safe anymore, and they needed to move fast. "Go! Now!" Ethan yelled. Rachel stumbled to her feet, still shaken but determined, and she dashed through the gap, barely escaping the clutches of the undead. They kept running, weaving through the city's back alleys, the sound of growls and snarls fading as the distance between them and the horde grew. Ethan looked behind, breathing a sigh of relief when he saw no immediate threat. For a moment, it felt like they had escaped. But Ethan knew they couldn't stop yet. They still had a long way to go. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice low but firm. "Stay sharp. We need to get to the rendezvous point before they catch up to us." The survivors nodded, their resolve hardening. They had made it this far, and now, they had to keep moving. There was no turning back. The streets felt eerily silent, the distant groans of the zombies a constant reminder of the peril that surrounded them. They had made it through the gap, but the danger wasn't over. Ethan could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The city around them was abandoned, its once bustling streets now barren, with buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of their own decay. But it wasn't empty, far from it. The streets were alive with the shuffling steps of the undead, and they weren't the only ones who had learned how to survive. "We have to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't know how many are out there, but we can't afford to stop." Mark glanced back down the alley, where the sounds of pursuit had become muffled. "Are we sure we're not being followed?" "Not yet," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning their surroundings. The sound of distant groaning, mixed with the occasional crash of debris, was a reminder that they were in the heart of what was once a thriving city now overtaken by the undead. The buildings loomed over them like giant sentinels, their glass windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges, and signs swinging loosely in the wind. "We're not stopping until we reach the rendezvous point," Ethan continued. "If we wait, we risk getting surrounded." The survivors nodded in agreement. Every step they took was calculated, with eyes constantly darting in every direction. Ethan kept his weapon raised, alert to any movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The once bustling metropolis now felt like a giant trap, with dangers lurking at every corner. As they moved through the streets, the group passed through neighborhoods that had been ravaged by time and the apocalypse. Abandoned cars sat in the middle of intersections, some overturned, others still with the belongings of their former owners scattered inside. It was a haunting reminder of the world that had been lost, a world of everyday life, now replaced by terror and uncertainty. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process the information he had gathered in the last few hours. The group they were headed toward, the survivors who had been able to make it this far, were their only hope for rebuilding what had been lost. But even that was a fragile hope. Would they find these survivors? And if they did, would they be willing to help? Trust was something that was hard to come by in this new world, and Ethan was unsure if even his leadership would be enough to convince others to join the fight. "Do you think we'll actually find them?" Ava asked, breaking through Ethan's thoughts. "We will," he said, turning to give her a reassuring smile. "We have to." The group kept moving, their footsteps muted against the cracked pavement. As they neared an intersection, Mark held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. "What's wrong?" Ethan whispered, already scanning the area. "Something's off," Mark said, his eyes scanning the buildings around them. "I don't like it." Ethan nodded. "You're right. We need to keep moving, but we have to be careful. The last thing we need is to walk straight into a trap." The group moved quickly, darting between buildings and using the debris as cover. Ethan kept a steady pace, making sure that no one fell behind. They reached another alley, but just as they were about to slip through, a distant cry echoed through the streets, followed by a series of shuffling footsteps. "Get down!" Mark hissed. The survivors immediately ducked behind the cover of a nearby wall, hearts pounding in their chests. The cry had come from a person, not a zombie, and Ethan knew that meant only one thing: survivors. But what kind of survivors were they? Were they friendly, or had they been driven mad by the chaos? There was no way to know for sure. Every encounter with another group could go either way, especially in a world where survival was the only rule. "Stay low," Ethan whispered, his heart racing. He peeked around the corner, trying to see who or what had made the noise. There was movement, but he couldn't tell if it was another group of survivors or something more dangerous. Suddenly, there was another shout, this one clearer, and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. "They're in trouble," Rachel said, her voice tight. "We can't just leave them." Ethan hesitated, torn between the desire to help and the need to stay safe. They had come too far to jeopardize their mission now. But the sounds of distress were hard to ignore. He could hear the desperate cries of people, followed by the sounds of a fight breaking out. "We don't have a choice," Ethan finally said. "We need to help them. We can't leave anyone behind." Without another word, Ethan led the way, moving cautiously toward the source of the noise. The group followed, weapons ready, every sense on high alert. As they rounded the corner, they saw a small group of survivors backed into a corner, fighting off several zombies with makeshift weapons. They looked disheveled, their faces etched with fear, but their determination was evident. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Get down," he shouted to the survivors, firing his rifle at the nearest zombie. The shot echoed in the street, and the zombie fell with a loud thud. The survivors froze, staring at Ethan and his group. For a brief moment, there was tension in the air, uncertainty about whether they could trust these newcomers. But when the zombies continued to advance, they realized there was no choice. The group's leaders nodded, giving Ethan the signal to join the fight. With a battle cry, Ethan and his group rushed in, clearing the area with swift, coordinated strikes. The sound of weapons hitting undead flesh was like a symphony of survival, and for the first time in hours, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. These people weren't alone anymore. Once the last of the zombies fell, Ethan turned to face the survivors. "You're safe now. But you need to come with us. There's a place where we can all fight back together." The survivors, now visibly exhausted but grateful, nodded in agreement. Ethan could see the relief in their eyes. These people had been fighting alone for too long. "We'll follow you," one of the survivors said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Lead the way." Ethan gave a determined nod. He had promised his group they would make it to the rendezvous point, and now, with more survivors in tow, their chances of success had just increased. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but for the first time, Ethan felt that the light at the end of the tunnel might just be within reach. "Let's move out," he said, leading the way. The group was growing, and with it, their hope for a future beyond the apocalypse. As they continued their journey through the silent, desolate city streets, the survivors felt a sense of cautious relief. The new group they had saved seemed grateful, but there was an undercurrent of tension between them. In this world, trust wasn't easily given, and Ethan could sense the wariness in the eyes of the people they had rescued. He knew that it would take time to truly earn their trust, but for now, they had a common goal: to survive. The group walked in silence, each footstep echoing off the buildings that loomed around them. Ethan kept his pace steady, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They had to reach the rendezvous point, but every corner they turned, every creaking door they passed, reminded him of how fragile their situation was. "Where are we headed?" one of the new survivors asked, a man in his early 40s, his face weathered from days of constant struggle. He was carrying a backpack that seemed to hold the last of his supplies. "You said you knew a place." Ethan glanced over his shoulder, meeting the man's gaze. He could see the skepticism in his eyes. They had only just met, and trust wasn't something that could be freely given. "There's a safe zone," Ethan explained, his voice steady, "a group of survivors who have been holding their ground. They've managed to keep the undead at bay, and we're heading there. You'll be safe once we reach them." The man nodded but said nothing more. He had to have his doubts. Ethan understood. In this new world, promises were broken every day. It was hard to believe in anything or anyone. The journey was slow, especially now that they had more people to keep track of. The survivors they had rescued were exhausted, and Ethan could see it. The way their shoulders slumped, the weariness in their eyes, it was clear they had been on the run for a long time. Ava, who had been walking beside Ethan, slowed her pace, glancing at the others with a concerned look. "Ethan, do you think they'll be okay?" she asked quietly. "I hope so," he replied, his voice low. "But we have to keep moving. We can't afford to be stopped." Rachel, who had been walking behind the group, caught up with them, her expression grim. "They're not the only ones struggling," she said, nodding toward the new survivors. "We're all carrying the weight of this world." Ethan didn't disagree. Everyone was tired, both physically and mentally. But they had no choice. If they didn't keep moving, if they didn't keep fighting, there was no future. As they reached the edge of the city, the landscape began to change. The tall buildings gave way to more open space, and Ethan felt the air change. The smell of decay seemed less overwhelming, replaced by the scent of wild vegetation that had started to reclaim the land. It was almost as if nature was trying to take back what humanity had once built. "Stay alert," Ethan said to the group. "We're almost there, but the dangers haven't disappeared." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a noise came from the distance, a low growl that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. He held up his hand, signaling the group to stop. Everyone froze, listening. The growl grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet. "They're coming," Mark whispered, his voice tense. Ethan turned to the new survivors. "Get ready. We might have company." The growls grew louder, and within moments, a small horde of zombies emerged from behind a nearby cluster of trees. There were only about half a dozen, but in this world, even a small group could be deadly. On your toes, Ethan commanded, raising his weapon. We need to clear them out fast. The survivors moved into action. Mark and James aimed their rifles at the oncoming zombies, while Rachel and Ava stepped in with their makeshift weapons. Ethan swung his axe, taking down the first zombie that approached. The sound of metal hitting bone was sharp and quick, and the zombie crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. The group moved in a coordinated effort, taking down the zombies one by one. But the tension in the air was thick, and Ethan could see the new survivors hesitating. They had been fighting alone for so long that the idea of working as a team was still foreign to them. Focus! Ethan barked, catching one of the new survivors off guard as a zombie lunged toward him. With quick reflexes, Ethan shot the undead creature in the head, sending it to the ground. We have to be in this together. No one's getting left behind. The new survivor nodded, his face pale but determined. He raised his weapon, finally getting the courage to strike back at the zombies. The battle was short but intense. In a matter of moments, the group had dispatched the remaining zombies, and the tension began to ease. Ethan's breath came in heavy bursts, but he allowed himself a moment of relief. They had made it through. Nice work, Ethan said, his voice steady but appreciative. That's how we survive. The group nodded, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. The new survivors seemed to have gained a little more confidence, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. We're almost there, Ethan said, looking ahead at the horizon. The safe zone was within reach. The promise of safety and community was closer than ever. But as they continued on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. They hadn't faced the real danger yet, the people who had made it this far and were willing to do anything to protect their home, even if it meant taking out anyone who came too close. Ethan knew the stakes. Survival wasn't just about fighting zombies, it was about fighting for trust, fighting for a future, and fighting for a chance to rebuild the world they had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were in it together. And that, for now, was enough. The sight of the safe zone ahead brought a surge of relief to the weary travelers. Ethan, however, couldn't allow himself to relax just yet. His instincts told him that something was wrong. The closer they got, the more uneasy he became. It was too quiet, almost too perfect, and that sent a chill down his spine. We're almost there, Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure everyone was still keeping up. The survivors from the city were moving slower now, exhausted but pushing forward. But they had made it this far, and now they were on the brink of something that could change everything. Or destroy it all. As they neared the perimeter of the safe zone, a single guard appeared on top of a makeshift watchtower. The figure waved, signaling them to approach. Hold tight, Ethan murmured to his group. He had to make sure that this place was truly safe before they walked right in. It wasn't just the zombies they had to worry about, it was the other survivors, the ones who had been holding out for as long as they had, and the ones who would do anything to protect what they had. The guard waved again, more urgently this time. It was a welcoming gesture, but Ethan didn't trust it. He had seen too many signs of desperation, too many people who would do whatever it took to keep their territory intact. Ethan didn't know these people, he had no idea what they were capable of. Stay alert, he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. This could be a trap. The group moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as they approached the gate. Ethan's heart raced, each step more deliberate than the last. He watched the guard carefully, noting the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His nervousness was evident. That was enough of a red flag. When they reached the gate, it opened slowly, a series of clicks and whirs signaling the mechanism at work. As the heavy wooden barrier creaked open, a man emerged from behind it, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a weathered face. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his eyes immediately scanned the group with suspicion. Ethan stepped forward first, his hand resting lightly on his weapon. We're looking for shelter. We heard you had a safe zone here. The man studied him for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the others. His eyes narrowed as he took in the ragtag group that had made the journey. They looked tired, desperate, like they hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks. "Who are you?" the man asked bluntly. "I'm Ethan," he replied, his voice firm. "We've been traveling for days. We need to rest, and we're hoping you can help." The man glanced over his shoulder, clearly unsure. The safe zone didn't look as well fortified as Ethan had hoped. There were barricades, sure, but they were shabby, hastily put together. The few structures in sight were nothing more than crude huts and tents. It looked like a place that had been holding on by sheer will, but for how long? "I don't know," the man's voice trailed off, and he seemed to be deliberating whether to let them in or not. "Look, we don't want trouble," Ethan said, his voice laced with urgency. "We just need a place to rest and regroup." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but we don't take in just anyone. We've had problems before, and if you're lying, you'll regret it." Ethan nodded. "Understood." The man motioned for them to enter. As they stepped past the gate, Ethan could feel the eyes of the other survivors watching them. They were quiet, their faces unreadable. There were no warm welcomes here, only the cold, cautious stares of people who had learned the hard way to trust no one. As they moved deeper into the camp, Ethan's unease only grew. The place felt like a powder keg, quiet on the surface, but with an air of tension just beneath. The survivors here were on edge, constantly eyeing one another, and Ethan could see that there were divisions within the group. Not everyone was as welcoming as the guard had appeared. Just as they were settling into a small makeshift area, a man stepped forward from the shadows, his posture rigid. He looked younger than the others, but there was something about him that immediately set Ethan on alert. "You're not from around here, are you?" the man said, his voice tinged with suspicion. Ethan studied him for a moment. There was something in the man's eyes, something calculating. Ethan had seen it before, in people who were looking for an opportunity to gain control. "We're not," Ethan replied carefully. "We're just looking for shelter." The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Funny," he said, "we don't usually get many visitors. And we've got enough mouths to feed already." Ethan's mind raced. Something wasn't right. This guy wasn't just being cautious, he was sizing them up, like they were pieces on a chessboard. "You've got enough food, enough supplies," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral. "But I think you're looking for something more, aren't you?" The man's smile faded, and for a split second, Ethan saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "We've got everything we need," the man said softly. "But if you want to stay, you'll need to prove yourself. We don't let people in unless they're useful." There it was. The unspoken condition. Ethan's mind raced, the implications of the man's words settling like a weight in his chest. This wasn't just a safe zone. This was a group with a clear hierarchy, and it looked like they were willing to do anything to keep their place at the top. "We'll prove ourselves," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the warning bells ringing in his head. But as he spoke those words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real test wasn't just surviving the zombies. It was surviving the people who were more dangerous than the undead ever could be. In that moment, Ethan realized that their journey had only just begun, and that the real battle for survival would take place not against the zombies, but against the very people they were depending on for refuge. As the days wore on, the uneasy tension that had settled within the camp only grew stronger. Ethan could feel it in the air, whispers that carried from one end of the camp to the other, furtive glances exchanged behind closed doors, and the restless movements of people who had nowhere else to turn. The walls of the safe zone were meant to protect them from the undead outside, but it was the living inside that were becoming the real threat. Ethan had hoped for respite, a chance to regroup and plan their next steps. Instead, he found himself tangled in the politics of the survivors, caught between people vying for control, and a growing sense of distrust that made everything feel fragile. The man who had welcomed them, Kyle, seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes, and it quickly became clear that he had no interest in sharing the power with anyone else. Ethan couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something was about to snap. The group's leadership was fractured, with factions forming around Kyle's authority. He wasn't a tyrant yet, but Ethan knew that if things went unchecked, the camp would descend into chaos. And chaos in a world overrun by the undead was a death sentence. It was late one evening when Ethan and Ava were sitting near the edge of the camp, watching the sun set. The air was still, but the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, a reminder that danger was never far away. Ava's eyes were tired, but she was always the one to see through the cracks in the world, the one who kept pushing forward, even when things seemed hopeless. "We can't stay here forever," Ava murmured, her voice barely audible. "This place isn't safe." "Not anymore." Ethan nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The walls of the camp might have kept the zombies at bay, but they couldn't shield them from the dangers within. Kyle had made his intentions clear. He was in charge, and he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened that. "We need to get out," Ethan said quietly, his mind racing with the implications of their next move. "But we can't just leave quietly. If Kyle catches wind of it, he'll try to stop us." "Then we fight," Ava said, her gaze hardening. "We fight for control. For the right to live." Ethan's heart pounded at the thought. A direct confrontation with Kyle would be dangerous, he knew that for sure. But they couldn't afford to stay in a place where survival meant bending to someone else's will. The next few days were spent in secret, gathering supplies, talking to those in the camp who were willing to listen. They weren't the majority, but there were enough people who felt as trapped as Ethan did. People who had seen the cracks in Kyle's leadership and were willing to take a stand. Together, they formed a quiet resistance, preparing for a final confrontation that could either lead to freedom or destruction. The night of the final stand arrived quickly. Ethan and his group had planned every detail, timing, movements, weapons. But as the hour drew closer, Ethan could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The world outside the camp was harsh and unforgiving, but the world inside was no better. It was a world of politics, betrayal, and manipulation. As they gathered near the edge of the camp, Ethan looked around at the faces of those who had joined him. They were a mix of the weary and the determined, people who had lost everything but were still fighting for something more than mere survival. They were fighting for a future. "Are you ready?" Ava asked, her voice steady, her eyes sharp. Ethan nodded, meeting her gaze. "As ready as we'll ever be." The night was thick with tension as they moved toward Kyle's quarters, each step bringing them closer to the inevitable. The camp was quieter than usual, as though everyone sensed that something was amiss. Ethan's grip tightened around his weapon, his nerves humming with the awareness that this could be the last thing he ever did. When they reached the building where Kyle was holed up, they hesitated for just a moment. The plan had been simple: confront Kyle, take control of the camp, and make it clear that they would no longer be ruled by fear. But nothing about it felt simple anymore. Ethan motioned for the others to take their positions. They had come too far to back down now. Inside, Kyle was waiting. He had been expecting them. "Ethan," Kyle said, his voice smooth and controlled, as though he were greeting an old friend. "I knew you'd try something like this. You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" Ethan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Kyle's. "You've been running this place with fear. People are sick of it. This is about survival, not domination." Kyle laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the stillness. "Survival? This is about control. You'll never understand. You've spent your whole life following someone else's rules. But out here, there are no rules, Ethan. Only power." A tense silence filled the air as the two men faced off. In that moment, Ethan realized that this was about more than just the camp, it was about the kind of world they were willing to fight for. Would it be a world of compassion, where survival was shared, or one where power ruled and survival was a privilege only for the strong? Without warning, Kyle lunged at him, his hand gripping a knife. The fight erupted in an instant, chaos, violence, a blur of movement as Ethan and his group struggled to subdue the man who had held them all captive under his rule. In the end, it wasn't the undead that claimed the lives of those who perished that night, it was the human greed for power. But with Kyle's defeat came the chance for a new beginning. The survivors who had stood with Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. but they had taken the first step toward a future where hope could thrive once again. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, bloodied but alive. The fight was over, for now. And in the distance, the first light of dawn broke through the dark sky, signaling the beginning of something new. It wasn't the world they had lost, but it was a world they could rebuild, one where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant living with purpose. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope.